Welcome back to another edition of Advanced Colorado. My name is George Brockler. Still, we are joined today by the fabulous, the awesome, the super experienced Katie Behnke. Katie, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, George.
Now, we're going to have a conversation about fundraising, but for those folks that don't know you, give us just the highlights of the 20 plus years you've been doing this.
Yeah, so I'm a fifth generation Coloradan, and I love conservative causes here in Colorado, and I've ran a political consulting firm here since 2001 in various capacities, but have played some role in various campaigns since 2001 here in Colorado.
Now, you've done everything from mayoral races all the way up to running the NRSC.
Running their fundraising operation, yeah, it was very fun.
What's that amount of money that you raised there, just to give people some perspective?
$132 million over 2 years.
Oh my goodness, that's
much higher limits.
You've done candidate races, you've done cause races, issue races. One of the things I guess I want to start with, and I don't want it to sound trite or obvious, but how important is fundraising in the scheme of things for a campaign?
I think campaigns begin and end with money. You can't have any portion of a campaign without having it well funded. And the funding often depends on the intricacies of the other parts of the campaign, whether that's communications or media or grassroots. All of them are tied in together with having successful fundraising operations.
Now, let's begin, and I've tried to do this with every segment, is a little bit of Mythbusters. Like, for people that are brand new candidates or they want to be involved, what are some of the big things that are just misconceptions about fundraising and campaigns?
Well, I think fundraising is fun, which is probably why I've made that my profession for 20 years. But I do think that candidates don't particularly enjoy fundraising, mostly because they're not comfortable asking for money for themselves. I think that's something that is learned and that a lot of candidates struggle with at the beginning of campaigns.
One of the things, as a guy who's actually run for office a couple times.
You loved fundraising?
I did not love fundraising. It was an acquired skill, and we'll get to that part of it. But one of the things that I found interesting, and in a Mythbusters way, was you are completely invested as the candidate in your campaign, and it's the most important office on the planet Earth. But in reality, chances are, unless you're running for a governor or the Senate or the president, your office never seems to be that important to other folks. You have to sell it to them.
It's very true.
What are some of the other things that you find with early new candidates, mistakes that they make in perception as to what's going to happen once they announce their candidacy?
I think candidates often think that because they're running, people will fund them, and it takes effort to raise money. Making sure that you have an organization ready to go to raise money takes effort and time. And I think that a lot of times candidates believe that if they simply announce, the money comes in, and that's just not the case.
What about the idea, though, that, look, there's a party, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, and certainly if you get to be the nominee, they're going to show up and just dump money into your account?
I think certainly there are donors that are invested in various reasons for various reasons. They believe in the Republican Party, they believe in a candidate personally, or frankly, they're fearful of the alternative. And so that lends itself to why people give to campaigns. But it does take a lot of discipline on the part of a candidate. A lot of times candidates don't like fundraising, so it's not a priority for them. But I think you have to be disciplined and you have to be organized in terms of making fundraising a priority for your campaign.
Now, what about the idea that we've just seen a superstar, Lauren Boebert, who managed to defeat an incumbent and win a congressional seat with like $50 and a great website and some tweets? So what about that?
Lauren, I think, is a unicorn. She had worked, frankly, very, very hard and traveled her district a lot and had a persona that spoke to low dollar donors that gave to her smaller amounts, repeat number of times. And those donors also were people that cultivated her grassroots organization. And so she was able to tie in her persona with a low dollar operation and a grassroots campaign that really spoke to the Republican Party in the third congressional district. But I think it's very rare that that happens for candidates.
Well, then let's get into something that may be more applicable to people across the spectrum in terms of whatever race they're running for. Do you have a fundraising philosophy?
You can't get something you don't ask for.
And what does that mean?
People don't just give money because you announce or you're the candidate. You have to ask them. And I think that's something that is learned from candidates.
We'll talk about some donor management, relationship building too, but how important is it once you have gotten that contribution, that donation, to follow up? Is that part of your philosophy as well?
I think it's relationships is key to fundraising, and people that are good at fundraising, that enjoy fundraising, are people that generally are good at managing relationships, because people are investing in you as a candidate and believe in your campaign or the cause that you're supporting, and making sure that when you ask someone for money and they make a pledge and say, yes, I will give, that you as the candidate or as the staffer are following up in an appropriate amount of time in an appropriate manner, whether that's a BRE or sending an email with information about where to give, or giving an online website where someone can fulfill that pledge. But then also making sure that you've acknowledged the contribution and that you've said thank you. And once people give, I think the hardest part is getting people to give. And then once they give, making sure that they feel honored by making that contribution. So are you saying thank you? Are you giving them updates? Are you providing them opportunities to continually be involved in your campaign, in your fundraising opportunities? Those are all things that make the relationship easier for candidates.
Before we get into sort of this pre-campaign organizational mode, which you've touched on, you said something that maybe not everybody knows. What's a BRE?
Contribution envelope.
Okay.
So business reply envelope, but is what it's short for. But we talk about them in terms of having a contribution form or a contribution envelope that has the legal language around giving, what the limits are, and it's always very important that you understand what you can legally accept as a candidate. So we always include that on a contribution form or a BRE, and then also the remittance information about where you can give your contribution.
So let's get to this pre-campaign organizational thing. I mean, what I've sold on, not just from what you've told me in the past, but from my own experience, is you do not want to develop a fundraising plan after you've announced. You want to have this thing in place before you press the green button. What are some of the basics for any candidate in setting themselves in a position to win before their campaign?
Great question. I think it's really important that your fundraising operation is all encompassing with your political operation, meaning you have a budget, you have a message, you have an allocation of time laid out for when you need money, how much you need it by, and when you're going to spend it. And a lot of that comes from the political team, and the best campaigns that I've been a part of are when the finance team and the political team are really working hand in hand to know when you need money by and how you're going to get it. And that's incredibly important.
Aside from the team aspect, because some of these folks are going to be running for school board, or they're going to run for city council, or maybe even county commissioner, and the idea of a team is who lives under my roof.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? My spouse or the volunteers. How do you keep this idea of fundraising being all-encompassing and working in this synergistic way with the political operation and the rest of it?
So I think it's important to dedicate time for fundraising. Otherwise, frankly, I think it doesn't happen. But I always advise candidates to make sure that they have a list of prospects of people that are in their network. So people on your Christmas card list, on your LinkedIn network that you have met, that share your same values, that are previous donors to a similar office, or have shown interest in that, and making sure that you have, I think it's easier to start raising money from the people that you know, and so cultivating that list. And then making sure that you have the infrastructure in place. Do I have a PO box? Do I have a place for people to contribute online? Am I tracking those contributions when they come in to make sure that they're legal? And one of the things that I'll be happy to show you, and maybe you can put on the screen, is a tracking contribution form. Good. As well as a tracking, kind of very basic tracking, because you need to make sure that you know who's given to you so that you can properly report that in a legal fashion. And also that's how you do your thank you notes. But I think more than anything, having a process identified at the beginning of when, and even it doesn't have to be intricate, but just knowing as a candidate, this is what happens when someone gives to me. I get it from the P.O. box. I am going to record the information, as much information as I have about that person. I'm going to put it in my spreadsheet. I'm going to deposit it at the bank. I'm going to send a copy to my treasurer or keep it for my financial report if I'm doing that myself. And I'm going to write a thank you note. And having that process outlined.
You touched on something here I want to follow up on. You said deposit it in the bank. I mean, that sounds like one of the very basics too. Got to open a bank account that is just for this campaign.
Yes, never commingle funds.
Never commingle funds. That's a good one.
Know the law.
Know the law, and we're going to hear from Suzanne Taheri, who's going to talk to us about that.
Good.
But what are some of the other basics? Have a bank account, yes. What are the other things you need to have in place logistically?
I think having a team of people around you, whether it's your volunteers or people that have run for office previously, or staff if you can afford them, but the people around you that are going to help echo your message for fundraising is always super helpful, and making sure that you have more people asking on your behalf. So I know, for instance, when you ran for office, you had a team of relationships that you had built, other DAs, other people that had run for AG, people that were attorneys that you had worked with.
People that owed me money.
People that owed you money. Not that you would leverage that.
No, never.
That you would never do.
No,
but making sure that you had your network identified of where you would receive support.
You had mentioned before about the BRE is another one of the basics. You got to have that P.O. box, and you're going to line it up with that BRE so that when someone wants to give money, you know where it's going and you're able to get it into that bank account.
Yes.
How often do you schedule yourself to go in and get the BREs from the post office box? I mean,
as often as possible.
Okay.
I mean, at the federal level, you have to deposit funds within 10 days of receiving them. And so you can't have contributions just sit in a P.O. box. I think it gets overwhelming when you have a lot of mail to process at one time. If you can do a little bit at a time, it's easier. I think it's also morale boosting to see when you go to the P.O. box and there's a contribution in there, that you can acknowledge and your hard work is paid off. That's
right.
That's fun. So I would say at a minimum once a week, if not twice, 3 times a week.
How about, do you need to have, in your opinion, the website set up to go with donation page built in before you launch?
Yes.
And why is that?
I think people look to websites for to make sure that you are legit and that you have your act together enough and have a legitimate campaign that you can provide information about yourself about how to give. So I don't think it has to be by any means expensive or all-encompassing, but I think at a minimum you need a bio with a photo, a statement about why you're running, and then information about where to contribute, if not online processing.
One of the things that you had mentioned before as we started to talk about, where do you find donors, right? You had said, look, start with the low-hanging fruit. Start with the folks in your family, if they like you, and other people on your LinkedIn page and all that other stuff. Where else can you start to go before you launch your campaign to start building this list of potential contributors? I
think like-minded individuals, so if that's people that go to your Rotary or your chamber or the extracurricular activities, I think there's support around the party that you can ask for help. But the thing that you can't do is solicit funds off of other people's public disclosures, meaning their reports. I think it's in often cases illegal, but it's also I find unethical.
And to be clear for folks that haven't done this yet, you can go to Tracer on the Secretary of State's website here and go and find everybody that's given any pennies at all to any issues or candidates. And it sounds like what you're saying is, and this is too bad because it would be super easy to use someone else's hard work and relationships. You can't just press print and then all of a sudden cold call all these folks.
I don't think it's effective either. I mean, the reason that people give is because of those three things that we talked about earlier: the relationship, they believe in the office, or fear. And so you're not going to know as a first-time candidate why that person gave to that candidate. And so I think it's sometimes a waste of time. That being said, if you have a relationship with someone that has run before and they would like to support you and they give you their list to run, that's entirely fine. And what people do often is use that to send an email solicitation or to do a direct mail solicitation or to invite to an event, something like that. And that would be an appropriate way to use a list from somebody, but you need their permission.
So you could also buy a list. I've heard of people saying, hey, look, I've developed this list over my many years in campaigning, and I would sell it to you in essence. Nothing wrong with that?
Nope.
How about this? Before you make that first ask, we've got to the place now where we've got the bank account, we've got the P.O. box, we've got the BREs, we've made this list of people we want to approach. Before you make that first call, what are the things you need to know or be able to build into what you're going to say?
The things that I have for candidates is practice. So using someone that you're friendly with to practice asking for money before you talk to people that you have maybe a less dynamic relationship with, because it's helpful to have some success before you go to people you don't know. But I always find it's helpful for candidates to have a script, and it can be something as easy as bullet points talking about why you're running, who else is running, kind of a lay of the land, the environment, and how people can help. And also, I provide sometimes a script for a voicemail, just because when you're first starting out, it can be awkward and you're not quite sure what you should say. And I've found that if you practice a few times and have some talking points, you eventually don't need it anymore because it becomes natural. But at least at the front end, it's nice to have that as a resource.
I think that's huge. That was huge for me. And one of the things that makes it challenging for a person who has grown up in middle-class Colorado is how hard it is to earn post-tax dollars. And that's what you're asking people for. And so when you pick up the phone or you see them face-to-face and say, can you please give me some of these post-tax dollars, having the answers to the questions you just raised are huge. And I got this a bunch, and that is, well, why are you running for district attorney? And if you don't have an answer, that isn't going to go very well, right? And I love the idea of starting with that low-hanging fruit list that you have. Start with mom or dad, or your uncle, or your nephew, or your neighbor, or someone who can be brutally honest with you, or at least get liquored up with you as they tell you why they're not writing you a check or something. I think that's hugely important. You talked about the reasons that people give. They have a relationship with you, they believe in you or believe in the cause, or fear. How much of that do you build into the script part of this? What do you need to have ready to go for this script, either for the voicemail or the in-person contact or the over-the-phone contact?
I think having answers to all three is important, but you tailor it to the person that you're speaking to. So if it's a donor that has traditionally given to a district attorney race, that they care about perhaps law and order, they care about supporting law enforcement. So you could speak to that person about those topics and what your experience is in that area. But I don't think that every donor is not the same, and I think you have to have some flexibility in your message, but consistency, and making sure that you're being authentic, you're being consistent, but you're also, tailoring your ask to the person that you're speaking with.
When you're developing a script, let's say for the voicemail, and we'll get to when to make calls and all that, but how long should you be looking to leave a message for? Because as a long-winded attorney, I could fill that whole thing up. I could
with
take
jokes.
up with jokes. There will be some substance, but a lot of jokes. Yeah. How much time should you be targeting?
I think you have to realize that these are busy people, and you want to leave enough information that they know why you're calling. It's funny, a lot of times I think people forget to say their name and what they're running for and the return phone number. Like at a minimum, you need to provide that information for people, which is why I think the script is so important, because it's easy when you get nervous to forget one of those three things. But at least when you have that, you can say, okay, I did that. But I think it being brief is important.
I get making the ask live, if you get someone live, in person, on the phone, whatever. If you're leaving a voicemail, do you make the ask in the voicemail, or do you say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I'm running for, love to talk with you about the race? How do you do that?
It depends on the donor, but I think it's generally, if it's someone you know, I think making an ask is totally appropriate. This is why I'm calling you. I'm calling to ask for your financial support. Love to give you an update on my campaign. Hey, I'm going to send you a follow-up email or send you a letter about why I'm running. That is entirely appropriate. But if it's someone that you don't know and you don't know if they're supporting you or not, I think asking to have a conversation to earn their support is more appropriate.
You had mentioned earlier when we were talking, even off camera, about the idea of one technique is to say, look, this amount of money will get me this kind of an outcome. Talk about that.
I think donors love to know what they're investing in. So one of the things that we did on some of the other campaigns that I've worked in is we'll say, feed our volunteers for the night. We're going to have a phone bank. Why don't you give $20 to pay for the pizza for 10 donors? Or a contribution of $500 gets me this many yard signs, or allows me to reach this many voters door to door. And I think anytime that you can quantify what you get out of giving, it's something that motivates donors.
I like that idea of making it visible and tangible to them. Like I'm not just giving money to someone to spend on God knows what. You're kind of telling them, directing where the money's going to go. I like that. We've got a lot of the nuts and bolts in place here to move forward. Now we're at the place of how do we know when and how to reach out to donors in terms of organization, whether it's the scheduling, what's the best time to do it? What advice do you give candidates?
Well, first of all, I think it's just that you're doing it, that you're asking. I find you'll have more success if you're making phone calls or trying to reach people during business hours, not in the morning, not at lunch, not at night when they're putting their kids to bed, and during the week. But more than anything, if your schedule allows you to make calls on a weekend, I think it's better to make the call than to get wrapped around the axle about, is it the perfect time? But you can be thoughtful about setting yourself up for success, which I think is, generally speaking, during business hours.
Look, even to this day, 4 campaigns in, I dread calling people that I don't have a well-developed relationship with and ask them for money, even though they're donors and they're likely to give. It is very, very difficult. How important is it to schedule time and, by golly, stick to that time?
I just think human nature is to not do the things that you don't feel comfortable doing. And so you almost have to make yourself fundraise, right? So scheduling the time on your calendar, like I'm going to do 4 hours a week, here's where I'm going to do it. And I think it's often helpful to have accountability, whether it's your wife or your partner or your staffer or someone that just holds you accountable to say, what are you going to accomplish this week? And then you report back. And that can be, anyone really within your support orbit. But I think making sure that you're doing it and not treating it like free time is important.
Look, that's key what you said there. You described either the spouse, the partner, the staffer. For some small campaigns, that's all going to be the same person. It's got to be somebody that can hold you accountable. It can't be somebody you feel comfortable saying no to, because you'll say no to them and you'll figure out a way around it. It's got to be someone who can say, sit down, grab the phone, and let's start working through this list. That's real. That's not fake.
But I think that's also why you set goals. So goal setting is really important, making sure that you have, I want to raise X amount of dollars by the end of the quarter. And identifying that goal creates the accountability I think that candidates need, and staffers or volunteers or whatever. Everybody can strive towards a goal, and that makes it easier to have accountability with the call time, because you see the movement forward towards that goal, and when you reach it, you can be happy that you did it and proud that it happened. But not having goals makes that difficult.
When you talked about, look, during the business week is best, not over lunch and all this, is there a sweet spot in terms of days of the week and times during those days?
I would say in terms of events, I've always found that you have better luck with doing things on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday evenings. If you're going to have a reception or some sort of
Fundraiser
get-together.
at someone's house, that kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
What about calls?
I'd say mid-morning, mid-afternoon.
Monday through Friday.
Yes.
But your point was well made too, which is like, look, don't not make calls on the weekend because you're freaked out about these were Katie's days and these were not Katie's days, right? It's important to make the calls.
Your network may be people like my sister who are, nurses and work 12-hour shifts. If that's your network, then you have to adjust accordingly. But generally speaking, that's if you have questions, call me.
One of the things that we had heard earlier on from Josh and Dustin was it was easier as an operative or a political supporter to say, hey, make this call and make this ask. But all of a sudden, when you're the candidate, man, it's awkward. What extra advice do you give people about doing that?
I think practicing is important, but also having, other candidates that have run that you can commiserate with is important. And have it's a common feeling. It's a common thing that candidates go through of thinking that it's awkward or being frustrated. I had one candidate that is a very high profile candidate that it was very successful who, when they first ran for office, spent 2 days making phone calls to major donors and never reached one person.
Oh boy.
Just really stuck through it for days and got very frustrated. And so I had him call, another candidate just to kind of commiserate about how much they hated it. But that hard work paid off and, they were elected and had a great political career, but still laugh about times where he will see someone and say, gosh, I called that guy so many times when I first ran for office and now they're calling me.
That's a great point too, because I think some folks think, okay, I muster up the courage to do this. I've got my script. I've got all the logistics squared away. I make the call. Am I going to get the donation? How many times do donors need to be contacted or touched?
I found that it varies, but I think in pandemic world, it's 3 to 5 times.
Wow.
And I say that with caution because you have to have tact. You don't want to be the person that is calling someone 5 times, 5 days in a row. That's annoying. No one likes that person. Don't be that guy. But if you have someone and you've made a phone call, you have an event coming up, you send an email inviting them to that event, or you notice that you have a mutual friend that could call them on your behalf and validate you as a candidate, that's 3 right there that are pretty soft touches without being over the top aggressive. Because what you don't want to do is just fixate on people and keep calling them and harassing them, and then you turn them off. Right?
It sounds a lot like
relationship building.
Sounds a lot like my brother and sister and I in the back of the car on the road trip. We were like, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? How about now? How about now? How about now? How about now?"
You don't want to do that.
No. Do you often have candidates who will reach out to donors and donors will just say flat no? And if so, what are the reasons?
Listen, like you said, this is people's hard-earned money, and it's their prerogative if they would like to contribute it to you or not. And sometimes part of fundraising is getting a no, and being okay with that and being able to kind of move on, maybe understand why it's a no. I find usually it's because they don't share your values. They're not interested in the race. They financially can't.
They might support your opponent in a primary.
They support your opponent.
I've run into that myself.
Yeah.
In terms of once you've got the contribution, you've got the donation, you've gone and collected it, you mentioned this earlier on, but what are the things you need to do to make that valuable? Not just, hey, I got my check and I'm moving on. What do you have to do?
Say thank you. Say thank you again. Cultivate the relationship. And what I mean by that is you should acknowledge when you're setting up your campaign and you're creating your process, it doesn't end when you get the contribution. I think fundraising has to be something that is a relationship that you cultivate so that they will give you again. And your ultimate goal is, once you get someone in the door to contribute, is to keep them engaged and to keep them motivated to help you. And people that contribute, sometimes that's all they do. They contribute, and that's their, that's their contribution to your campaign. But people do have time, talent, treasure, and sometimes they will give you all three if you have cultivated that respect. And so when someone gives, acknowledging it by saying thank you, and then giving them the opportunity to continue to stay involved. So whether that is providing a newsletter of what you're doing via email, inviting them to events, doing a conference call or a Zoom that's an insider donor update, something like that. But I find that candidates that have that portion built into their finance plan are generally more successful, because people feel updated, they feel invested, and they feel involved. It's not, I gave my check and I never heard from this guy again.
Well, and unless you're going to run for just one term, chances are you're going to be looking to these people for support. Again, how can people, nuts and bolts stuff, what are the ways in which you can thank someone? Because I can see this depending upon the number of contributions. Maybe you get 1,000 $20 contributions.
God willing.
That's right. That could gobble up a ton of your time.
Yeah.
How do you prioritize how to do what to do when it comes to thank yous?
So I think a lot of it is candidate driven, what they want to do. Senator Gardner wanted to acknowledge every contribution that came into his campaign. With $29 million raised in a 6-year cycle, that meant that we had to hire a direct mail firm that we would draft a letter, and every 2 weeks we would pull down the donor file and they would just send it for us, because it was simply too many donors to do it in a timely fashion. But when I've worked on mayoral races, we would create a threshold. So for every person that gave $250 or more, whatever that number is for that you as a candidate, they received a handwritten note from the candidate. But if it was under that amount, we would do a standard computer-generated thank you note and simply have the candidate sign their name and get those out. I've also seen campaigns do email thank yous, like having somebody, once they contribute, they automatically receive a thank you. It just varies, and sometimes people will just pick up the phone. I'm just calling to say thank you for your contribution. But I think it's just having one of those or a combination of them that works for you for time.
How much of that can you delegate to a volunteer if you have a small operation?
All of it, if they're competent.
I can't tell you how many letters I signed and went through, and it's easy to just throw your signature on it, but one of the things I tried to do was, one, to read how it's all formally advised, but I know the guy is Tom, not Thomas, so strike a line through it, to kind of personalize it in some way. And I think that really pays off down the road. You hear from these people later on, and they're like, hey, I got your nice note. Thank you for that. And then keeping them invested in that, I think that's a big deal.
We didn't have a solicitation in Corey's thank you note, but oftentimes the mailings would pay for themselves, because people would put contributions back in there, because they would say, I've been giving money to various causes, and you're the only one who's ever thanked me.
Oh my gosh.
And so he would get these notes. I actually put it on our campaign refrigerator, like with a bow on it. Like, see, this is why we say thank you.
Yeah, that's a big deal. We've talked a lot about the phone calls, the in-person stuff, but we've made reference to other ways. How should candidates approach fundraising? Just the in-person stuff? Just the live stuff? What are the other vehicles for getting money in the door?
So I think having as many lines in the water, like you're fishing, right? You want to have a lot of hooks in the water and see where the fish are biting. And then if for some reason one's not working, you can kind of see what else is going on. But I always advise to have as many different forms of fundraising going on simultaneously, mostly to my point that you don't know how many touches it's going to take to have someone give. But also you don't necessarily know the people that give for the community, and they want to go to an event or they want to meet other like-minded individuals. And so I think having various ways of giving, so whether that's events or phone calls or conference calls or Zooms, direct mail,
A direct
emails,
mail costs money, right?
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, you takes money to make money.
Okay.
So there's firms that do it, but I think one of the simplest ways to do direct mail is to when you have the support of another candidate that's run that perhaps would have a donor list, asking if they would sign a solicitation letter under their signature for you, asking for support. You get the third-party validation and you have the ask to their list. But you just have to be very careful because you don't want to spend a ton of money. And I generally say, if you're going to do an event, you need to keep your costs below 10%. Like if you're going to raise $10,000, you should really try not to spend a ton of money on. You don't need the top shelf liquor.
Right,
you can do beer and wine. You can do appetizers. People aren't there. You want to provide something so you're not cheap. But it's not awkward. But you don't need to be breaking the bank on fancy catering.
But the alcohol really helps people write bigger checks. Is that what you're saying? I feel like that's what you're saying.
Sometimes helps.
Couple things too towards the end of this, and that is, a lot of these folks aren't going to be able to have paid staff and all these things. What are the key positions related to fundraising that you need to have somebody competent, whether it's paid or volunteer, to fill?
So I think you have to have someone that is making sure that you need to know as a candidate the law. And Suzanne will be great in explaining that to you. But I think it's really important that you know the law, you know what you can ethically and legally do as a candidate in terms of fundraising, because every race is different. The limits are different. The people that you can accept funds from are different. And that's incredibly important to know that. And so having an attorney or someone that understands the law that can explain it to you, or you look it up yourself, but that is like priority one.
And we've called them compliance people. Like there are folks out there that this is their business. They do compliance. They're very good at it. They're reliable. Definitely check them out, because you don't want to hire someone to do compliance that's going to get you caught up in trouble.
Right.
And Suzanne will talk about this as well, but you make a mistake there, it could
bad
be
press.
Bad press, and you do not want that at all, as well as a fine, a distraction from the campaign. How about a treasurer?
Legally, you have to have a treasurer that is responsible for the activities of the campaign. So sometimes that's a volunteer position, sometimes it's a professional position, being a treasurer or an attorney that you hire to do that. But you definitely need a treasurer, and you, I think in some capacity, need, like I said, that process for
For my campaigns for district attorney, my treasurer was my father, and he's recently started speaking with me again.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot. It's a lot of work. That's why if it's a volunteer, they got to be smart. My dad's wicked smart, and they got to love you in a way. I mean, they got to be committed to the cause, because it is easy to not do a good job, and that's a real problem.
And sometimes it's better to keep it to the professionals. I'm sure Mr. Brocker was great, but
he was like a professional. So what else? Anything else? Like when you talk about a campaign or a finance chair or a finance committee, is that absolutely necessary for some of these smaller races or something like it?
I think, as you have larger campaigns, having more people asking is part of that, another line in the water to fish off of. But I think a lot of times you're not going to have a formal structure. So when you're first running for office, it may be your best friend who's going to call and help, or another candidate, or somebody that's a staffer that can fill that role. But I find that having more people ask is another tool for raising more money. So having a finance committee, whether that's loosely defined as someone that gives X amount, but maybe they're willing to use their name. You can, when you call, it's a third-party validator, former elected.
Is that ever a substitute, though, for the candidate calling? I mean,
no.
Because listen, if I could, I would have off-sourced that to someone. Just say, please, you make all the calls, because it just feels awkward.
If you ever figure that out, let me know.
But it's just not successful.
Probably put me out of business.
Listen, in the last 3 hours that we have,
Good.
in the last moments that we have, what would you tell these brand new, never-before candidates to send them off on their way to raising the funds necessary for victory.
Thank you for running. I think it's so exciting that you're making the decision to play a part in our process. I'm excited for you. I think it's fun. Not everybody may agree with me, but I love raising money because it's something tangible that you can either have immediate success or not. You know if you're doing well or not because the numbers speak for themselves. But I think if you put the time and effort into it, you will be successful. If you have a message, you're running for the right office, and you put the work in, I think you'll be successful. And it's just exciting that all of you are running and going to take that step. It's fun.
Katie Behnke, thank you for making us that much smarter on fundraising. We'll be back next time with another topic called Why Didn't I Raise Any Money? No, I'm kidding. We could edit that part out. Katie Behnke, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Take care.